The ground is soaked from days of rain. Mud clings to boots and uniforms alike. A low fog drifts between shattered trees, dulling sound and distance. German infantry crouch in shallow foxholes along the edge of a broken field. They have been here all night, listening, waiting. Artillery has already passed through once. It always does. The men expect the usual pattern now: bombardment, probing fire, then hesitation. That pause is familiar. It gives time to breathe, to adjust weapons, to believe the line will hold. But this time, something is different. Through the fog, shapes begin to form. Not running, not scattered, moving forward in measured intervals. American soldiers advance methodically, rifles up, spacing exact. When one group slows, another takes its place. When fire erupts, it does not stop the movement, it reshapes it. There is no rush, no dramatic charge, only pressure. From their positions, German infantry watch in disbelief. They wait for the moment the advance should stall. It never comes. And as the distance closes, an unsettling realization settles in. This is not hesitation being tested. It is absence. The reason for that absence begins long before this field was ever reached. By the autumn of 1944, the German army was no longer fighting the war it had planned. 5 years earlier, it had moved across Europe with speed and confidence. Its infantry divisions had been built around short campaigns, decisive maneuvers, and rapid collapse of enemy resistance. That model had worked in Poland, in France, in the early months of the Soviet campaign. But by late 1944, the world surrounding the German infantrymen had changed completely. On the Eastern Front, entire armies had been shattered. Operation Bag Ration, launched by the Red Army in June 1944, destroyed Army Group Center almost entirely. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were killed, captured, or simply vanished into retreat. The losses were irreplaceable. To compensate, divisions in the West were stripped of experienced men. Veterans were reassigned east. Replacements arriving in France and Belgium were often younger, undertrained, or drawn from units never meant for frontline infantry duty. Some had fired their rifles only a handful of times. Others had not trained together as units at all. At the same time, Allied air power had changed daily life at the front. Daylight movement became dangerous. Supply columns traveled at night. Command posts were pushed deeper into forests and villages, relying on couriers rather than radio transmissions that could attract air attack. For German infantry, this created a sense of isolation. Orders arrived late. Ammunition was rationed carefully. Artillery support, once a pillar of German defensive doctrine, became unpredictable. Fuel shortages immobilized armored support that infantry had long relied upon. Morale reflected this reality. Letters home spoke less of victory and more of endurance. Diaries recorded exhaustion rather than confidence. Defensive positions were prepared not with optimism, but with resignation. Yet the orders remained the same. Hold the line. Delay the enemy. By time, nowhere was this pressure felt more clearly than on the Western Front after the Allied breakout from Normandy. Following Operation Cobra in July 1944, American forces surged across northern France with speed that shocked German planners. Defensive lines were improvised rather than established. Units were committed piecemeal, often without proper reconnaissance or coordination. German infantry found themselves defending terrain they had never seen before: hedgerows, villages, forest roads, against an enemy that seemed to appear everywhere at once. By September, the retreat reached the German borderlands themselves. The war had come home. In places like the Hürtgen Forest, Aachen, and later the Ardennes, German infantry were tasked with holding ground at all costs. But the cost was increasingly borne by soldiers who no longer believed relief would come. They were fighting not to win, but to slow what felt inevitable. And it was in this environment of fatigue, attrition, and shrinking resources that German infantry first encountered a distinctly different pattern of American behavior at the front. One that did not rely on sudden breakthroughs or dramatic charges. One built on something else entirely. Across the lines, the American army arriving in Western Europe was the product of a very different war. For the United States, the conflict had never been fought on home soil. Its factories ran without bombardment. Its training grounds were intact. Its doctrine had been built deliberately, revised repeatedly, and tested across multiple theaters before large-scale land combat in Europe even began. By 1944, American infantry divisions were not expected to win battles alone. They were one component of a larger system. At the core of that system was firepower. American doctrine emphasized suppression over shock. Infantry units were trained to advance not through speed, but through continuity, moving while the enemy was pinned, paused, or repositioning. When resistance appeared, it was not met with immediate retreat or hesitation, but with requests for supporting fire. Artillery was central to this approach. U.S. divisions possessed a level of artillery coordination unmatched by any other army in the war. Forward observers moved with infantry units, equipped with radios that could call down fire within minutes, sometimes seconds. Batteries several kilometers away could concentrate their fire on a single point with devastating accuracy. For German infantry, this was disorienting. Traditional expectations no longer applied. Destroying an advancing platoon did not halt the attack. Another simply took its place. Pinning down a company invited artillery response rather than withdrawal. Behind this system stood logistics. American supply lines stretched across oceans, yet delivered ammunition, food, medical supplies, and replacement personnel at a scale that German soldiers struggled to comprehend. Units rotated men out of the front line more regularly. Wounded soldiers were evacuated quickly. Even exhausted formations could be pulled back and reconstituted. This had a psychological effect. American soldiers advanced with the knowledge that they were part of something continuous. Losses were expected and planned for. Positions were taken not because every man was fearless, but because the structure surrounding them allowed forward motion to continue regardless of individual hesitation. Leadership reinforced this. American non-commissioned officers were trained to assume command immediately when officers fell. Small unit initiative was encouraged within clearly defined objectives. If one approach failed, another was attempted without delay. For German infantry accustomed to rigid orders and dwindling support, this adaptability felt unsettling. The battlefield rhythm had changed. There was no single moment of collapse. No dramatic breakthrough, just steady pressure, advancing yards at a time, supported by overwhelming fire and uninterrupted replacements. By the time German infantry realized that this was not recklessness but design, the distance between the lines had already narrowed. The advance did not pause to reassess. It adjusted and continued. And when German soldiers looked up from their foxholes and saw American infantry moving forward again, after artillery, after resistance, after losses, they began to understand that this advance was not asking permission from the battlefield. It was simply proceeding. That understanding would deepen as contact turned into confrontation. For the German infantrymen on the ground, the shock was not immediate. It accumulated. At first, the American advance appeared cautious. Infantry moved in balance. Squads paused, signaled, and waited for fire to lift before moving again. This was familiar enough, but then the pattern repeated, again and again. Positions that had been held through one engagement were forced to engage again within hours, sometimes within minutes. There was no long regrouping on the American side, no visible hesitation to reassess the cost. For German infantry already stretched thin, this created emotional fatigue long before physical exhaustion set in. Men reported a growing sense that resistance no longer produced the expected results. Inflicting casualties did not bring relief. Holding ground did not slow the tempo. Every defensive success felt temporary. From a human perspective, this was deeply unsettling. German soldiers were trained to expect reaction, retreat, pause, or maneuver when sufficient resistance was applied. Instead, they saw replacement units step into the same fire lanes without visible disruption. POW interrogation reports from late 1944 repeatedly mentioned surprise at the calmness of American infantry under fire. Not fearlessness, but predictability. They advanced when artillery supported them. They halted when resistance intensified. And then they advanced again. Tactically, this reflected a fundamental difference in approach. American infantry doctrine emphasized combined arms at the lowest possible level. Riflemen did not carry the burden of stopping the enemy alone. Machine guns fixed positions. Mortars suppressed. Artillery reshaped the battlefield. When German infantry engaged one element, others continued to function. This fragmented German defensive responses. Instead of stopping an attack, resistance merely shifted its direction. Instead of breaking the assault, it redirected it. From the German side, this appeared as relentless motion. Even during pauses, the Americans were active, repositioning, calling for fire, bringing up ammunition. There was no sense of waiting for permission to continue. Enemy reports began to reflect this realization. German frontline assessments increasingly described American attacks not as reckless or desperate, but as unavoidable. The phrase appears repeatedly in divisional summaries, a recognition that once contact was made, disengagement became unlikely. The battlefield no longer offered clear stopping points. Every engagement blurred into the next. And as German infantry struggled to maintain cohesion under this pressure, they began to confront a deeper problem, one not rooted in bravery or training, but in systems. Because behind every advancing American soldier stood layers of coordination that German infantry could neither fully see nor effectively disrupt. That reality would become even clearer when viewed through additional lenses. Beyond the immediate clash of infantry, the American advance was supported by tools and structures that quietly shaped every engagement. Radios were among the most decisive. At the platoon and company level, American units relied heavily on portable communication. Forward observers moved close to the front, often exposed, relaying coordinates back to artillery batteries positioned far beyond German reach. Fire missions could be adjusted in real time, walking shells forward as infantry advanced. For German infantry, this created the impression of omnipresent firepower. Defensive positions that had taken hours to prepare could be rendered untenable within minutes. Machine gun nests were neutralized not by direct assault, but by concentrated fire delivered from unseen guns. Attempts to counter this system were limited. German radio networks were often restricted by shortages, damaged infrastructure, or fear of interception. Artillery units lacked ammunition to match American volumes. Requests for fire were delayed or denied altogether. Leadership at the small unit level further widened the gap. American non-commissioned officers were trained to make immediate decisions under fire. If an officer was wounded or killed, the advance did not stop. Another voice took command. Orders were brief, direct, and focused on momentum rather than perfection. German infantry leadership, by contrast, was constrained by rigid command structures and diminishing trust in higher headquarters. Field leaders often lacked authority to withdraw or reposition without explicit orders that might never arrive. This imbalance had moral consequences. German soldiers began to question the purpose of holding ground that would be retaken within hours. The cost of resistance no longer seemed tied to strategic gain. Each engagement felt like a delay purchased at the expense of irreplaceable lives. American soldiers, while not immune to fear or exhaustion, operated within a framework that validated sacrifice through progress. Every advance, no matter how small, was reinforced by visible results. Captured terrain, secured villages, stabilized supply lines. This difference mattered. It shaped how soldiers interpreted danger. For Germans, survival increasingly meant withdrawal or capture. For Americans, survival was linked to forward movement supported by overwhelming fire. By late 1944, German defensive doctrine on the Western Front had shifted from stopping attacks to managing collapse. Positions were abandoned sooner. Counterattacks became rare. The goal was no longer victory. It was delay without annihilation. Yet even this adjustment struggled to counter an enemy whose advance did not pause when expected. The Americans did not rush. They did not gamble. They advanced because the system allowed them to. And as German infantry lines bent and thinned under this steady pressure, the moment approached when disbelief would give way to recognition, a realization forged not in theory, but in fire. That realization would arrive at a specific place, at a specific time, when the advance crossed from persistence into decision. November 1944. The western edge of the Hürtgen Forest. The terrain itself had already defeated armies. Dense evergreen trees blocked visibility. Narrow trails funneled movement. Mud swallowed vehicles and slowed artillery. For German infantry, this ground was familiar. Defensive positions had been prepared over months. Interlocking machine gun nests, concealed mortar pits, pre-registered artillery zones. It was a place designed to force hesitation. American units advancing into the forest knew the cost. Previous assaults had stalled. Casualties were high. Progress was measured in meters, not miles. From the German perspective, this was where momentum was supposed to die. When American artillery began again at dawn, it followed a recognizable pattern. German infantry waited in bunkers and foxholes, counting the shells, listening for the lift. The moment after the barrage was usually decisive. That moment came, and the Americans moved. Infantry squads advanced along narrow forest paths, using compass bearings rather than landmarks. When fire erupted from concealed German positions, the lead elements dropped, returned fire, and fixed the defenders in place. They did not retreat. Within minutes, radios crackled. Coordinates were sent. Artillery answered. Shells burst among the trees, shredding branches, collapsing trenches, forcing German infantry deeper into cover. As the fire shifted forward, American units followed it, step by step, clearing ground already churned by explosions. German defenders inflicted losses. Men fell. Stretcher teams moved forward under fire. Still, the advance continued. Reports from German units that day note confusion rather than panic. Positions that should have held for hours were overrun in less than 30 minutes. Counterfire failed to disrupt coordination. Even when American units were pinned, adjacent units maneuvered around the resistance rather than waiting for it to collapse. By mid-morning, entire sections of the defensive line had been breached, not through a single breakthrough, but through accumulation. German company commanders requested permission to withdraw. Some received no response. Others were ordered to hold regardless of losses. By early afternoon, American infantry reached positions that German maps still marked as secure rear areas. The realization spread quietly through the ranks. This was not an attack meant to test the line. It was an advance built on the assumption that the line would eventually give way and structured to ensure it did. As daylight faded beneath the forest canopy, German infantry began pulling back in small groups, abandoning weapons they could no longer carry. Behind them, the sound of American movement did not slow. It followed. And with that pursuit came the moment German defenders had hoped to avoid, the recognition that the advance would not pause long enough for the line to be rebuilt. As night settled over the Hürtgen Forest, the fighting did not end. Visibility shrank. The forest closed in. For German infantry, darkness had once been a shield. It offered concealment, time to reorganize, a chance to slip away from pressure. This time, it brought no relief. American units halted only long enough to consolidate. Positions were secured. Flares rose above the treetops. Listening posts were pushed forward. Within hours, the advance resumed. German rear positions, lightly held, assumed safe until morning, came under sudden contact. Not massed assaults, but deliberate probes supported by mortars and coordinated fire. The tempo remained unchanged. Field reports from German battalions that night describe a growing sense of inevitability. Commanders noted that American units appeared prepared to operate continuously, rotating elements forward while others rested briefly before rejoining the advance. There was no clean break in the fighting. When German infantry attempted local counterattacks, they met immediate suppression. Artillery arrived with speed that suggested prearranged planning rather than reaction. Attacks dissolved before reaching American lines. By dawn, several German companies had ceased to function as cohesive units. Not annihilated, but fragmented. Men withdrew independently or surrendered when cut off from command. Captured German soldiers later described their surprise at how little the American advance seemed to depend on a single moment of success. There was no pause to celebrate ground taken, no rush forward to exploit collapse. Instead, the advance behaved like a tide. It filled gaps. It flowed around obstacles. And once it passed, it did not recede. By the second day, German divisional headquarters acknowledged that the defensive plan for that sector had failed. Reserves were insufficient. Supply routes were compromised. Communications were unreliable. The line no longer existed in any meaningful sense. For the German infantrymen, the defining realization was not defeat. It was recognition. Recognition that the Americans were not waiting for the right moment to advance. They were advancing because their system allowed no reason to stop. This absence of hesitation reshaped expectations entirely. It undermined defensive instincts built over years of war. It stripped meaning from the idea of holding ground through sheer endurance. When withdrawal orders finally came, they were overtaken by events. American units were already pressing into what had been designated fallback positions. The advance had not broken the line in a dramatic instant. It had made the line irrelevant. And in doing so, it marked a turning point, not just for the terrain of the Hurtgen Forest, but for the psychology of German infantry facing the American army in the final months of the war. The consequences of that realization would ripple outward beyond the forest into the broader collapse that followed. The weeks following the Hurtgen Forest engagements made the lessons of relentless advance unmistakable across the Western Front. German infantry units, already stretched thin, began to experience the same pattern repeatedly. Defensive positions that had been painstakingly prepared along rivers, ridges, and villages were overtaken not by sudden breakthroughs, but by the steady, calculated pressure of American combined arms operations. Hesitation was punished not by a single decisive strike, but by an accumulation of firepower and forward movement. This had immediate strategic consequences. The breach of forested lines allowed American forces to move toward the Roer River and prepare for crossings into the German heartland. Supply routes previously considered secure became vulnerable. German commanders were forced to commit reserves to plug gaps, often only to see American units maneuver around them. In many cases, this resulted in disorganized withdrawals or piecemeal counterattacks that failed before they could fully form. Numbers illustrate the toll. Divisions defending sectors of the Hurtgen and surrounding forests were reduced to fractions of their original strength. Equipment losses were significant. Artillery, mortars, machine guns, and even small arms often could not be recovered. For the Allies, the pattern repeated. Despite casualties, the advance continued without pause, supported by a system designed to replace losses immediately. Psychologically, the effect on German infantry was profound. Reports from late 1944 note that men began to anticipate American movements not through reconnaissance, but through assumption of inevitable progression. The shock of seeing units advance without hesitation turned into a deep unease. Soldiers questioned the meaning of holding ground when the system behind the enemy allowed continuous motion regardless of local setbacks. The momentum achieved by American forces had a compounding effect. Every advance created new staging areas, improved logistics, and allowed units to consolidate before the next push. The Western Front became increasingly untenable for German defenders, and by the time the Ardennes offensive began in December, the German army faced not only physical exhaustion, but an organizational and psychological disadvantage rooted in these earlier encounters. Historians later described this period as the moment when the nature of German defensive warfare on the Western Front fundamentally changed. It was no longer sufficient to rely on fortifications or localized resistance. The systemic pressure of the American advance forced German units into reactive, fragmented operations. The collapse of the Hurtgen positions, therefore, was more than a tactical defeat. It was a clear demonstration of how modern warfare, industrialized, coordinated, and relentless, could render traditional defensive doctrine obsolete. And yet, the story did not end with withdrawal. It set the stage for the broader push into Germany, where the human cost, strategic consequences, and lessons of relentless American advance would resonate across the remaining months of the war. The advance of American soldiers through the Hurtgen Forest and beyond was not marked by sudden heroics or dramatic charges. It was a testament to systems, discipline, and preparation. Each soldier was part of a larger mechanism, a network of logistics, fire support, and command that ensured movement continued, no matter the obstacles. For German infantry, the shock lay not in the courage of the enemy, but in its constancy. Every pause they expected was replaced by steady pressure. Every hesitation they anticipated was absent. The battlefield had become a space where individual actions mattered, but systems determined outcomes. Historically, this advance illustrates a turning point in modern warfare. Industrial capacity, coordinated tactics, and adaptability outweighed traditional defensive skill. The psychological impact was as decisive as the physical one. Armies can be undone not just by firepower, but by the realization that resistance alone cannot stop the machine moving against them. Human cost was immense on both sides. Soldiers faced exhaustion, fear, and loss, yet their experiences reveal more than numbers. They reveal how discipline, planning, and relentless execution shape outcomes, often before engagement reaches a climactic moment. The Hurtgen engagements stand as a study in the evolution of warfare, how relentless advance, supported by doctrine and logistics, can erode not only terrain, but the very expectation of defense. It was a war defined by systems, yet fought by individuals. Each step forward a measure of human endurance, and each pause and resistance a reflection of fatigue, strategy, and inevitability. In the end, the story of German infantry stunned by American persistence is not one of shame or valor alone. It is a lesson in the weight of organized pressure, the quiet power of methodical movement, and the enduring human reality at the heart of war. That history is shaped as much by structure as by courage, and by the persistence of those who move forward step by step without hesitation.